All right, Rodney, here you go, man. This is a space. Did you see that? Did you see that thing that your wife posted on Facebook about? It's like this picture of this dog with big eyes, and it says every time Steve talks about, I think she said space or something like that, and the dog's like,
Yeah, she made sure and showed me that.
that was funny. Yeah. Okay, so for all you people, that's you, but okay.
All you people.
Okay, this is what he says. I was listening to your 11-part series on Genesis chapter 1. Is your chapter 1 series 11 parts?
That's an old one. Yeah.
Okay. Because you haven't been through Genesis in a long time.
Yeah, not in a while. I'm planning on going back through it again.
Very cool. Okay, all right. So on Genesis chapter 1, on the speed of light issue and light traveling all the way across the universe, I've heard that the laws of thermodynamics were not in play in the same way before the fall, specifically that there was no decay. If that is true, then physics would have been very different, given that it would not indicate that we would just not know what the rules were before the fall. Question.
Yeah. Here's the thing about the second law of thermodynamics, and that's the idea that everything's decaying. You can't get rid of all the laws of thermodynamics because, for example, it's the laws of thermodynamics that when I slide my hand across this tablecloth here, my hand kind of sticks, and that has to do with the laws of thermodynamics. But there's something fundamentally different in physics from before the fall to after the fall, because you have the situation again with decay. The Bible talks about decay enters in and death enters in and that kind of thing. And so there are some of those laws that have to be functioning. Otherwise, you're going to have problems with your digestive system, and there's all kinds of stuff that depends on the laws of thermodynamics. But the whole decay thing, it looks like something was radically different with that, and the Bible specifically says that God changed it.
So this is what I think of as the second law, right? To where energy is exchanged with one another until it reaches a base point, like a heat death. So in order to have a creation like He created it, like a eternity, like to live forever, that couldn't have been there, right?
Right.
So, at least number 2.
Yeah. Well, it has to be there on some level. Okay.
All right, that's where I'm not following you then.
So there's got to be heat transfer and that kind of thing.
Right.
But as far as everything ending up in a, when you're talking about a heat death, that's the idea that the molecules get separated in such a way that you don't have hot spots anymore. Everything ends up going cold, basically, and the heat spreads out throughout the universe. And so you have that whole thing. But generally, when you're talking about the second law of thermodynamics, it's the idea that everything tends towards disorder. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. The whole idea that everything tends towards disorder, that you basically everything's falling apart.
Right, entropy.
Is the second law. Yeah, it's an increase in entropy, and it's you have to have some part of that second law as far as heat transfer and those kinds of things taking place for metabolic processes to work and that kind of thing. So there has to be some part of that there. But as far as the entropy part, in the sense that everything has to fall apart, like for example, you take a car, stick it in a garage for 15 years, and it's going to fall apart, and you haven't done anything to it, and it's that kind of thing. Or
everything.
Yeah,
our bodies, everything.
Yeah, everything is like that. And so it's that part of the decay that it looks like was different. So you have some differences in the laws of thermodynamics, but again, you're going to have some part of that. And I'm sorry to get in the weeds on that, but you have that. He was talking about the speed of light. Was that his issue?
It said the speed of light issue and light traveling all the way across the universe, and then he goes into the thermodynamics.
Okay. The speed of light issue has to do with, obviously we're looking out with telescopes right now, and we think, and this is based on theory that astronomers have, astrophysicists have on distances being connected with redshift specifically. And I just opened up a can of worms. The idea of a redshift is this: that when you look at light, when you look at light from our sun, there's a spectrum, and in that spectrum, we can tell what the sun's made of because certain elements spike in the spectrum, and so you can tell that there's helium there, and you can tell that there's hydrogen there, and you can tell, there's going to be spikes, and so you can tell what kind of what's being burnt on the sun. If the sun was moving very quickly towards us, all of that light would be scrunched up in between us and the sun, and what that would look like on a spectrum is it would be shifted towards the blue. And so you'd have the same spikes in the spectrum, but basically those spikes would be shifted towards the left on a spectral analysis. And what we see when we look out at stars, distant galaxies, is we can tell where the spikes are. We can see spikes for helium, we can see spikes for hydrogen, like I was just talking about, but they're in the wrong place, and they're shifted towards the red. And that red shift has to do with what's called the Hubble law, and the idea behind that is when you get a certain distance from the Earth, or from our galaxy, there is a red shift in each one of those. As the red shift gets more and more pronounced, that's an indication that the galaxy is further and further away. And I'm sorry again to get in the weeds, but that's the whole deal with the redshift. And so we're looking at things that are 14 billion light years away, and where you get a light year from is the distance light travels in a year. And so if it's 14 billion light years away, then presumably it would take 14 billion years for that light to get to you. And so that's called the distance problem, or the light distance problem. And evolutionists like to throw that into the face of creationists and say, well, we see these things that are 14 billion light years away, and light is a constant. The speed of light is a constant, and so therefore, your whole idea that it's a young universe or a young Earth is a bunch of nonsense. And what they usually don't know when they're saying that, usually they don't know this, is that the evolutionists have exactly the same problem. Because when you look at the temperature of the universe, if I can look out 14 billion light years that direction, and then I can look out 14 billion light years that direction, well, that's a total of 28 billion light years. And the universe, according to the evolutionists, or according to astrophysics, is 13.7 billion years old. So there's not enough time for the temperature of the universe at that end of the universe to match the temperature of the universe at that end of the universe, and they do. And so what that means is that part of the universe, we were talking about second law, that part of the universe has been in contact with this part of the universe because the temperatures are all the same. It's kind of like taking a pan and sticking it on your stove. Well, you take a pan and stick it on your stove and come up and grab the edge, and it's still cool. You know that pan has not been there very long. But if you come up and grab the edge and it's hot, you know that pan's been on the stove long enough for the heat to have dissipated throughout the whole pan. And what I'm telling you is that if the pan was the universe, we don't have enough time for the heat to have spread out to the edges of the universe to what we can see, and yet it does. And so that's a light problem, a light speed problem that the Big Bang has, and they've come up with all kinds of, well, actually with one specific theory to explain that whole thing, and it's just nothing but trying to keep the Big Bang together, basically. It's called the horizon problem. So everybody has a light speed problem, is what I'm saying, and there are some good answers to that. The idea that light may not have always been a constant, that's one option. Another option is that time changes depending on whether you're in a gravity well or at what speed you're going, and so there's some different, some really interesting cosmologies that deal with that whole thing. So for example,
that's when my mind just gets tripped out. Like what the Interstellar movie?
Yeah.
And I like to geek out a little bit because it says that God is a God of light, so I try and figure that stuff out. But when you're talking about time travel, and then you can be in the same spot like are at different spots at the same time, and God being outside of time, it just gets wild.
Right.
At least as far as my human brain can.
Yeah. And so, for example, just real quick, if you have what's called a bounded universe, and that means you have a boundary to the outside of the universe. Evolution or Big Bangers believe in an unbounded universe, and I won't get in the weeds on that. But if you have a bounded universe and you start off with the universe all in one place, then you have the biggest black hole there ever was. And for the universe to spread out, God has to change the gravitational constant, and then everything starts moving away. Well, as it starts moving away, that black hole becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. It actually becomes a white hole at that point. It becomes smaller and smaller. And when you get to the edge of effectively what would be the white hole or a black hole, when you get to the edge, which is called the event horizon, if you have an observer at that edge, you can literally have billions of years taking place out here while hours are taking place for somebody on the edge of an event horizon. Of a black hole, or like I said, a white hole that is that massive.
And we know that for a fact.
Yeah, it's Einstein's theory of relativity.
Yeah, but not even a theory, because I don't know about that, but
the time changes.
The time is what's the dimension?
Yeah, time is different for somebody who is moving quickly,
right? Depending on where you're
versus
at,
somebody who's
right.
sitting still. It's also different for somebody who's in a gravity well,
right.
like on a planet, versus floating out in space. Time is different for those two things. And so, time changes depending on your environment. So,
all right. So for that question, the rules before the fall, well, I mean, we know that they were drastically different. Mm-hmm. Obviously, because sin wasn't in creation yet. But when you talk about there was no until the flood, the whole rain system, what's it called?
Yeah, hydrologic system.
Hydrologic system was totally different.
That's what it looks like. Yeah.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
Obviously creation, the death was different. We talked already about the thermodynamic stuff. It was a different.
Yeah, it's a different
setup.
world, and it's going to be different again. And so when God does the new heavens and the new earth, people have bodies, and they last forever, and there is some upkeep that's taken place because the Bible talks about these fruits by the river that comes from the city of God, and there's 12 manner of fruits, and they're for the health of the nations. And it says healing in my translation. It's literally the health. And so it's kind of a preserving the health type thing. And there was some of that going on at the original creation. That's why God said, I don't want them to eat from the tree of the fruit from the tree of life. Otherwise, they're going to remain in their situation. And so God does things to circumvent the law of decay. So, yeah.
All right, I just want to say one thing about the whole, because sometimes I think people, this is what I think people, it's really hard to go through that stuff, if you don't have an engineering, scientific type of Hanford background or whatever, they just kind of zone out. But when I got saved, the first study I went through was Book of Genesis, just because I thought it was the first book of the Bible, and unbeknownst to me, it was a Chuck Missler study. Mm-hmm. And it took me 8 months to get through, because I had no idea what he was talking about.
Yeah.
But at the end of that, when you're going through the creation and stuff, it opened up my mind to other passages in the Bible that I understand because of going through that.
Right.
So instead of just checking out, I think there's a ton of insight. And, I know you've gone through Genesis and maybe we'll again here soon. But when you're talking about creation and all that stuff, there's a ton of insight that I think are foundational understanding a lot of parts of Scripture and the rest of the Bible.
Well, yeah. If you don't know Genesis, you don't know. If you have no idea what Genesis says, you don't know the reasons for salvation.
Right.
I mean, literally, why Jesus would have to come, and it's because of the fall of man. And everything. If you don't know Genesis, you don't understand Revelation. Right. Everything we lose in Genesis, we regain in the book of Revelation. And so Genesis is fundamental to everything that's going on throughout the rest of the Bible.
Yeah.
So,
and even some of the weird stuff, like we were talking when you're talking about what's the study of quantum physics,
mm-hmm.
some of that stuff, okay, it looks a little bit weird, but it helped me a lot understanding, like, how can a dimensional being be outside of time?
Yeah.
You know, how can God know my thoughts and be everywhere at once? Like, some of the basic Sunday school questions were answered for me by going through some of that weird science stuff.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to say.
Yep. Yep. It's good stuff to know, or at least to know where you can get answers to.
Yeah.
So.